We're off. So, as always, if you have any questions, please make sure that you use the text box in your screen. And what we'll do is we'll get our two experts. So, because I only just hit record after I did the intro, I will let Phil and Ashley maybe just do a quick recap of who they are once we get to them. So, for the moment, as we get going, our objectives today. So we're going to cover off a few things. First is we'll look at having an understanding by the end of this of how we maintain basic fitness standards for the community end of the game, and Phil Dunn will help walk us through some of that. We'll also have an understanding of how to maintain basic nutrition standards throughout an off season. That should say off, so I'll fix that for when this goes out. But Ashley will run through what that looks like for us. And then finally, as we always do, most notably because we have BC still in the midst of their season, we'll just be reminded of the World Rugby High Tackle Framework and its implementation across the country. So how does tonight's topic fit in with our referee profile? So as we always do, we're just going to take a look at the importance of the topic in regard to some of the key factors we look at trying to have our referees improve on week to week. So I think the key point we're going to get across today is that our fitness and our personal well-being can have a drastic impact on our ability on game day itself, as well as the lead up to, and the physical fitness part of things helps us maintain a proper mental state when it comes to making technical and tactical decision making. The evidence obviously shows that the more tired we are, the less likely our brain is able to keep up with the pace of the game and the pace of needed decisions. And so what we end up doing is making the secondary, tertiary decision as opposed to what was probably the first infringement and therefore the more relevant decision. And then finally, it also helps us ensure we are in the right frame of mind to effectively manage players in the game. So from a game management perspective, we look at creating a positive environment, our communication skills. Are we able to properly make those things work and function properly, knowing that we have to, that we might be bringing things from off the field onto the field. So these are all things that hopefully tonight's topic will help us address. So I'm not going to talk about any specific key factors of our three pillars, just that these types of initiatives here we'll work on will hopefully help us be able to better manage ourselves on the field, as well as then be able to better make decisions. So with that, and without further ado, I'm going to pass the voice over to Phil Dunn. So Phil, if you can just give us a quick recap of some of your experience, and then as we mentioned, just say, Nathan, hit the next slide, and then we'll go from there, mate.
All right, good man. Thanks, Nathan. Evening, everybody. So as Nathan mentioned, I'm Phil Dunn, and you might have picked it, but I'm from the Republic of Ireland and currently residing in Ottawa, Ontario. So my background in rugby is primarily comes from working with World Rugby for close to 10 years on the Sevens World Series, and in that role, I provided an applied sports science support services to the male and female referees appointed to the Sevens World Series. And as I came to the end of that role, I moved over to Canada, and currently I'm working with an organisation called Own the Podium and the Canadian Paralympic Committee as a sports science advisor, working with Paralympic sports, and I'm also doing a small bit of consultancy work with the Major League Rugby referees, moving into this season and last season as well. So hopefully that gives you a decent, a reasonable amount of background as to who I am. And if you have any questions moving through this presentation, don't hesitate to shout out, and I'll do my best to answer them. So next slide, please, Nathan. So what I'm trying to do this afternoon is to give you a bit of an overarching view of what your physical conditioning program should try and achieve as you move through your season and into your off season. So I'm not going to get overly specific, because if you know me, I'll probably talk all night about that kind of thing. So I want to try to keep it as concise as possible. And to start off, I'm going to just talk to some of the the overarching training goals that you want to try and achieve when you plan out your training program. And to keep it as simple as possible, when you're planning out what your training program is going to be, the first idea is to try and determine if it's going to meet the physical demands of the game. And what the physical demands of the game basically mean is some total volume that you're going to, or total distance that you're going to cover, what your heart rate looks like on throughout the duration of a match, how many sprints you do, how many accelerations you do, how many decelerations you do, how many changes of direction you do, and then what that might look like when it comes to planning out a field-based session for yourself or planning out a gym-based session. So essentially, yeah, you're trying to meet the physical demands of the game, and then a secondary focus then is we're trying to minimize the risk of non-contact injury through the planning of your training program. I always use the phrase that an injury on a referee is like rust on a boat. And when a referee picks up a non-contact injury, that's usually a pretty significant factor in terms of them potentially being deselected or just moving themselves out of the game. And so it's really important that we maintain as much of a positive health status as we can across the season to make sure that we're available for selection week in, week out. And then thirdly, it's very, very important to, while also focusing on your training program and your referee appointments across the season, it's really, really important to make sure that we maintain a positive health and performance balance. So it isn't just all about performance. A lot of it is about health as well. So that we're deliberately programming in some recovery methods into your program to ensure that you're as healthy as possible to achieve the optimal performance when it comes to refereeing your games. So on to the next slide, please, Nate. And so I always try to break it down into rules of thumb. So this, instead of getting overly specific, because everybody has their own circumstances and are unique humans in and of themselves when it comes to trying to plan training programs. So I always try to drill it down to drill it down into some rules of thumb that you can live by. And number one for me is, especially in season, is your hardest session of the week should be the furthest distance from a game, furthest distance from your previous game, and also the furthest distance from your next game. So basically what that means is if you have a game on a Saturday and you have a game on the following Saturday, your hardest session of the week should be the furthest possible distance from those 2 points, and that's usually a Tuesday or Wednesday. So that's your starting point in terms of rule of thumb. So you plan your hardest session in and around that time, and then your other less intense sessions should be planned in and around that. Second is, as I said in the first slide, health is a pretty high priority. So recovery requires activity. So you need to plan and prioritize it. And what that means is recovery isn't always just passive rest where you're just sitting on the couch watching Netflix. For the majority of the time, it actually involves some low intensity activity, whether it be aerobic activity on a bike, or whether it be a mobility program where you're on the gym floor mat and you're moving through a sequence of mobility exercises like stretching, activation exercises, that kind of thing. So it's actually making sure that that is deliberately programmed in your training program is actually a high priority. And next one, Nate. And then this is a priority for me, and what I try to communicate to referees is prioritize speed over stamina. Reason being, speed is a quality that's easily lost, especially as we all get older. Stamina is a quality that can be maintained quite easily with a low level of training volume across a longer period of time. So the more that we neglect speed, the easier it's lost, or the quicker it's lost. And then when speed is gone, that's when it's more difficult to meet the demands of the game around accelerations, decelerations, top speed running. And that's where we start to move into the zones where we're at a risk of injury. So prioritizing any speed type training sessions and so any speed type drills within your training program is, for me, a higher priority from a consistency standpoint than it is trying to clock in as much volume as you can from a long distance running or a repeated interval standpoint. So they're my training program rules of thumb.
So Phil, just to pick up on that, and I'm assuming some of the examples you'll give will reflect this, but in that sense, it almost makes the time commitment potentially a little bit shorter for referees during the week in order to maintain speed over stamina in some ways, potentially.
Yeah, so probably my fourth rule of thumb would be quality over quantity. So when it comes to prioritizing speed over stamina, so Nathan's right in terms of the duration of the sessions. It's very, very possible to get a really good quality training session around speed in 30 to 35 minutes. And that includes a 15-minute warm up and then 20 minutes of high quality top speed reps around speed. And what I think it's important for people to realize is that when you I think sometimes people don't take it into account is that your games themselves are a physical stimulus, and you do actually get a physical adaptation from those games, especially because you're under a heightened level of stress as well. So they maybe are perceptually more demanding than they actually are, but you still do get a pretty reasonable physical response from your game. So if you think you're refereeing week on week on week, trying to just replicate that in what your training sessions is maybe if replicating like for like maybe a bit redundant. And if you prioritize speed, which is a ever decreasing quality as we get older, over stamina, it could be a better way to manage or minimize the risk of injury. Yeah, so on to the next one there, Nate. Thanks. So this is what an example training plan looks like, and I always, instead of trying to present like a 12-week training plan or a 16-week training plan, which typically seems to suit a lot of people, I always try to break down to what a week looks like, because I know I live in a real world, and trying to plan from week to week is sometimes a challenge. And I can only imagine that when you try to add in refereeing every Saturday in and around that the ability to plan long term becomes compromised. So what I always try to do is to break it down into what a week looks like, and then you build from there. So here's an example training plan for a match day, Saturday to Saturday. And on the top row, it's obviously Sunday to Saturday. Below that's intensity, and then below that's focus areas. So imagine you have a game on a match day on a Saturday. And as I said in my first slide, or in the slide previous, like rule of thumb around when your hardest session be, so it should be from the furthest distance from your previous match and the furthest distance to your next match. And so in there, it's match day +3. It looks like Tuesday. So there you go. That's when you program your hardest session. And then either side of that, based on when you have the most time available, that's when you can program in your easy session, hard session, easy session, you name it. But again, always focus on the hardest session being when you're freshest. So that the period that's from the match and to the match, the furthest distance. Sorry. So within those sessions, so as I said, on the hardest session there, that's where you look at your high intensity running or speed work. Then on your second hard session, if that's what you program, that's when you'll maybe potentially look at some more strength and power. And then on your easy days, that's when you're looking at some of the prehabilitation, like mobility and activation activities, some off-feet aerobic work on a bike potentially, and then you name it, foam rolling, yoga, any types of activities that you like to engage in, but isn't too physically demanding to minimize or to impact your recovery for what your hard session is going to be on a Tuesday. So basically, that's the basic template, and that's always subject to change. But that's why I like to always just drill it down to what a week looks like. So on to the next slide, Nate, please. So this is a couple of example sessions from what the sevens referees used to do on a World Series. And this will be a session that this would have been our hard sessions. This would have been our middle of the week session, furthest distance from the last tournament and furthest distance to the next tournament. And what we tried to do on the Sevens World Series is to build out a week-to-week schedule for around physical conditioning that the referees could then take into their own environments, and then utilize the tools that we were sharing with them to be able to modify their training programs on a week-to-week basis in in response to their ever-growing list of appointments across the world that they used to be appointed to. So in those sessions, what we always used to do was, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, is always start off with a warm-up. And that warm-up, we always used to use a template called RAMP, which is raise, activate mobility, and performance. And so that the warm-up duration will take about 15 minutes. And within that, in a hard session, we'd always progress to a level of intensity where right at the end of the warm-up, we'd be in a position to do some pretty high intensity sprints. So as I was saying before, it's very possible to condense a training session around speed into a pretty short period of time if you are time sensitive. So that's how we used to program our warm-ups. Then on the left-hand column there, you'll see our ABC exercises were a Bronco. So we used to incorporate a Bronco into a pretty regular training program for the referees, purely from a monitoring standpoint, to make sure to give everybody the opportunity to assess where they were physically. And in sevens, we used to do that because everybody was traveling from different parts of the world, had a different appointment schedule as everybody else. So it always just gave people an opportunity to check in physically to see where they're tracking, and then we could have a conversation as to what we could do to modify the training for the rest of the week or 2 weeks to make sure that they're fully prepared for the competition. Then we move into a speed complex where we'd have an acceleration and deceleration drill, some jumping drills, and then some top speed or max speed efforts as well. And then followed up by coat hangers, which is a pretty intense high speed running interval drill that the referees seem to enjoy. Then on the other side, again, it's a combination of warm-up that builds up to some high-speed sprint work. Then we move into some agility-based activity, then back into some sprint drills with some plyometric work, and then finish off with some Bronco reps, so 60, 40, 20 meter reps, and then we finish off with some games. So basically that's how we tend to structure a hardest session of the week. And the beauty of planning it in this manner is that we can always increase the intensity, decrease the volume, include another version of or different version of a rep or an activity, or there's just so many options there we have to be able to change the session based on how the group or individual is recovering or what type of activity is coming up in the future. So that again, the design of this session kind of links into how we planned out our training weekly training plan as well. So any questions about that, just fire them up on the question board and I'll be happy to answer. Next slide, Nate. This is a recovery session, so we split it into two options: pitch and gym recovery. So this is typically the session I'd recommend that you do on a Sunday or Monday or after a Saturday game. Again, warm-up is always grounded in the RAMP template: raise, activation and mobility, and performance. And then in the main body of the session, we'd have in the pitch, we'd have some low intensity aerobic tempo runs, followed by some plank activation exercises, and then we finish off with a game. Or alternatively, in the gym, we'd be on a bike and we'd be doing some aerobic capacity intervals where they're really low intensity. They just get the heart rate up to a 75, 85% level. And then within our rest periods, we're doing some activation and mobility exercises to get some movement around the joints that would have got smashed over the weekend during your game. So on to the next one, Nate. Right, so then I've mentioned the RAMP protocols quite a bit. And so I think this is what I think from my observation of referees generally, and I've lived in this world for quite a long time, is that I see them as a really, really good opportunity to treat them as a mini session. So if you think you're out on the pitch for about 90 minutes, sometimes the game is physically demanding where you're constantly on the move. It's a high scoring end-to-end type of game, and you're covering a lot of meters. Sometimes the game is a pick and go game phase to phase to phase, pick and go, scrum to line out, where you cover a pretty minimal amount of distance and you don't feel physically taxed at all. So knowing that there's a big range in terms of the intensity of games you're going to be, one thing you can control in terms of your physical preparation is treating your warm-up as a mini session. So again, it's 20 to 25 minutes prior to your game, where you can go through the ramp protocol and then finish up in the last 5 to 10 minutes and getting some really top quality work done, especially around speed or power, where you may actually not have got that session in during the week as well. So actually, it's a really good opportunity to treat it as a mini session. Next one, Nate. Yeah, so when you're building out your warm-up protocol, try and think about the type of movement patterns you have when you are on the pitch refereeing a game. So are you completing a lot of short accelerations? Are you changing direction laterally quite a lot? Are you pivoting over his shoulder quite a lot? So if you just reflect on the type of movement patterns you have in a game, you're able to incorporate them into your warm-up, so that you are physically prepared for the demands of the game that you're about to encounter. And that's a really important thing to consider in terms of what Nathan was saying around the profile of a referee. So that once you're physically prepared for the demands of the game, your profile when you're refereeing the game will respond to that. So you'll likely be in a better space when you're trying to apply a little bit of game management with individuals throughout the game. So try and mimic the demands of the game where possible. And then this is another thing I think is a gap, and I mentioned it previously, where how often, if you think when you're a referee that you've been out on the pitch for 90 minutes and it's been a wet day, and as soon as you blow the final whistle, you jog 50 meters, you get into the car and you drive home. And that's obviously, practically speaking, that's probably the best plan. But when it comes to what impact that's going to have on your next day and the next day following that, you may wake up a little bit more sore, a little bit more fatigued, and a little less fresh mentally. So what a planned and deliberate recovery protocol post-game will allow you to stimulate a little bit of blood flow into those neglected areas, and focus on maybe some breathing where it can relax you a little bit more, because obviously you referee a game and everybody is it's a pretty stressful environment for the majority. So if you can incorporate some breathing or relaxation activities within that where possible, then you can downregulate your nervous system so you can be a little more settled. And then you can also, as Ashley will probably mention, you might actually focus on some refueling and the appropriate refueling strategies that you can have in place to minimize muscle damage, you name it. Yeah, so that's my rules of thumb around warm-up and recovery. So on to the next one, Nate. So this is the ramp system. It's really, really straightforward, but I'm a big fan of acronyms, and I'm a really big fan of systems, because one, acronyms are easy to remember and systems are easy to hand off to other people to work with themselves. So if you go on to the next slide, Nate. So this is what I call a ramp system, and this is what I tend to just share with referees when I'm working with them around how they prepare their own warm-up and recovery protocol for around a match day or a tournament in sevens. So on the left-hand side there, you'll see all the circles in red. And so looking at roughly 20 minutes of a warm-up, we try to break it down into raise, which is 3 to 5 minutes, activation and mobility, which is about 5 to 7 minutes, and then preparation. So that's a 20-minute warm-up moving into the match. So then post-game, so we have 90 minutes of a performance under our belt. So then in the window post-game, we're looking at trying to maximize that 20 minutes to be able to recover effectively to make sure that we're ready to go come Sunday, Monday, when we want to start getting stuck into our training program again. So again, mobility and activation, you're into that space in around 7 to 10 minutes. And then in regeneration, I always like to devote about 10 to 13 minutes in that space. So again, you're looking at 20 minutes. And again, always subject to change. It's a nice template to use, and then you can implement any sort of the systems or any sort of the exercises you have in that to make it work to your most suitable patterns.
Phil, we have a question that seems relevant at the moment, but we're assuming raise means raising your heart rate?
Yep, that's the one. Yep.
Yep. And then a question about what you mean at each of these stages. So what would be an example of a raise activity, of an activation, of a mobility, and of your 10 minutes of prep?
Yep, so that'll be on the next slide.
Excellent.
Yep. So here we go. Here we are. So this is probably a little bit too much detail, but you'll see in the 3 columns I have why, how, and what. So we can fly through this column, Nathan, if you just want to populate everything. There you go. So there's our why, how, and what for all of them, and so that's basically just giving you the reasons why we're doing it, how it looks from a planning perspective, and what sort of exercises we do. So at the bottom there, we see the raise row. And so that's 3 to 5 minutes. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to increase the heart rate, we're trying to increase our body temperature, we're trying to increase our focus. What does that look like? I have a group some drills and exercises that I use with referees, and I call them a multi-directional grid or an agility grid. And what that simply is a fixed movement pattern. So a cone drill that you can set up a fixed cone drill in whatever sort of pattern that you want. But the idea is you are going to be completing a low intensity running activity around that drill for the extended period of 3 to 5 minutes. So the idea is you may set up a multi-directional grid where you're moving forward, laterally, backwards in a fixed pattern across, say, the in-goal area from one side of the pitch to the other. And the idea is to complete that exercise within 3 to 5 minutes at that low intensity, starting off very, very slow, and then starting to increase the speed in which you move around that grid, where you're starting to feel a response around your heart rate, and you're starting to feel an increase in your body temperature, and you're taking the time to switch on and think about the upcoming game as well. So you have that 3 to 5 minute space to actually get moving, get the sweat rate up, get the heart rate up. Then for mobility and activation, this is more the static based drills. And again, the idea is we want this to be a flow based group of exercises. So you're not just in a static spot moving from left, or you're not just in a static spot and letting the benefits of the heart rate and body temperature increases go to waste. We're trying to incorporate mobility and activation exercises that require a little bit of a dynamic effort. So for example, on the right hand side there, reverse lunge with a rotation, a bent leg walk with a mini band, acceleration wall drill, and a linear pillar skip. So they're types of exercises that I tend to recommend around those areas. But again, a lot of it's on feet. A lot of it has a pretty strong or pretty dynamic movement pattern to it, and then it also leads quite well into the preparation phase. Preparation phase is where we're trying to mimic the demands of the game. So that's when I said previously, could reflect on what sort of your movement patterns you tend to execute in a game. So are you an individual that accelerates a lot? Are you an individual that decelerates a lot? Do you change direction quite a bit? Do you pivot over a right or left shoulder quite a bit? So just think about that and then consider how you can replicate that in a game. So I just have in the what corner there, top right corner, a number of hollow sprints. You can look that up on YouTube. You get an understanding what hollow sprints are. Curve sprints is basically just trying to sprint on a curve, which is what referees tend to do quite regularly in a game. And then if you have your ARs with you, try and incorporate some evasive games. So some keep away, tag, you name it, where you are responding to some random stimulus like you do exactly in a game. So again, it's trying to mimic those demands of the game to the point where you're fully prepared when you step onto the pitch for the first minute of the game. So next slides will go into a little bit more detail as to what it looks like, so you can just populate it all again, Nick. So then this is basically a a warm-up protocol that I've used with some referees in the past, and it goes down into the minute by minute, rep by rep structure. So we're starting on if we start in the bottom row, so that's where we pop in our multi-directional grid. So you're just moving continuously. So you're looking at about 4 to 5 rounds of a multi-directional grid where you're moving forward, laterally, and backwards, and just repeating that for 30 seconds. And then you're moving straight into some more long distance efforts. So you're going in goal, running touch to touch for 30 seconds. And once you've completed that for 30 seconds, you're straight back into the multi-directional grid. And at every time, at every set, you're increasing the speed or intensity in which you're moving. So you're trying to, in that 5 minutes, really focusing on trying to get that heart rate and body temperature up. And then bang, straight into activation and mobility, where we're trying to focus on, for this particular referee, we're trying to focus on some really deliberate activation exercises. So we're trying to get the calves fired up with the ankle dorsiflexion band work, trying to get the glutes fired up with some glute bridges, and then up onto the feet, trying to fire up the glutes from a standing position as well, and then into a reverse lunge with a rotation for the upper body. And then to finish off, moving into some lower intensity plyometric small jumps that aren't overly intensive, but will prepare you for what you need to do in the preparation phase. Then into the prep phase, so that's 10 minutes. That's where a hollow sprint. So a hollow sprint, to describe it basically, is where you're trying to cover a distance of about 50 meters, but the sprint constitutes of a slow jog to start with a 15-meter acceleration. Then you have a 10-meter deceleration down into a jog, and then accelerate back into another 15-meter sprint. So it's almost like waves of acceleration across a longer distance. Then back into a multi-directional grid, working at a higher intensity. Flying sprint basically is a starting off at a jog, progressively increasing the speed across a distance of about 60 meters, trying to move into some of your max speed range, so like a top speed sprint for about 10 to 15 meters. So start slow, finish fast. And then we finish off with a multi-directional grid again, working at the highest intensity you can for those 2 reps of 45 seconds. And then by the end of that 20 minutes, you will have accumulated a mini session basically, but you will be fully physically prepared for the next 90 minutes as well. Or even to break it down even more so, the first 10 to 15 minutes of a game that is hitting you like a truck in terms of stress and intensity. So if you're fully prepared for that from a physical standpoint, then you've done half the battle. So yeah, that's all from me, I think. Is there anything else there, Nathan?
No further questions. If you don't mind hanging out for a little bit, we'll see if anything pops up by the end,
Cool.
and then we'll move on to Ashley.
Right. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks. Phil, I know we're very lucky to have Phil in the country, and I know we're also very lucky to have him involved in multiple facets of not just rugby, but referee development and referee training as well. So it's great to have you around. Thanks again. We're going to move on to Ms. Ashley Armstrong. Ashley will, oh, Phil, we had one more slide, mate. It's the cool down.
This is a recovery. Just fly through all that. Sorry, Nate.
That's all good.
Yeah, so this is the recovery stuff. Keep going. Yeah, there we go, right?
Right.
Keep going. Yeah. So basically the idea behind the recovery is trying to increase some blood flow to clear some metabolic byproducts and reduce DOMS, low intensity exercises. Then you're moving into the regeneration phase where you're trying to replenish some muscle tissue and then slow down the nervous system. So what I tend to recommend is some exercises, just some floor-based stretching exercises for that 7 to 10 minute window. And then in the 10 to 13 minute regen window, that's when we focus on maybe some cold water immersion, contrast like hot cold showers, breathing exercises, foam rolling, that suite of activities that tend to relax an individual or tend to accelerate recovery from a nervous system standpoint. So just pop up one more slide. I think there's one more slide in it. Yeah, there we go. So in what I did, and did this with one of the MLO referees actually, because he's pretty keen on yoga. And once the season kicked off, he used to lose out on a yoga session. So what we did, we built in a yoga regression for him to do in that 10 minutes post the game. So he's still getting his mini session in from a yoga standpoint. So we were able to just program in just a basic flow structure for him, and he could just work through that for 10 minutes. And then moving into a breathing sequence of 3 minutes where it's just tempo based breathing into some foam rolling, some trigger point work on his calf, hip flexor, and glutes, where they tend to have the most soreness or accumulation of most damage across a game. And then everybody loves a nice hot cold shower as well. So he used to jump into the contrast shower and do 2 minutes hot, 1 minute cold for a few minutes as well, and that'll be him finished. So again, idea is deliberately plan for it and it'll happen. If you don't plan for it, it won't happen, and then you'll potentially suffer the consequences of that. But the more that you reflect and plan on how demanding your game is week to week and what you have planned for the upcoming days, the easier it is to plan something deliberate around your match date and to make sure that you're fully prepared for week on week rugby over the season. And so that's definitely me. Job done.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. We're going to move quickly to Ashley, just aware of the time. So Ashley, if you don't mind giving a quick little hello and where are you from and what you do, and then you can hit the button to do your thing.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank Nathan for having me on. I am a registered dietitian and I specialize in performance nutrition. I was living in Victoria for the past 6 years, working with our men's and women's national sevens teams and their nutrition programming. And I now reside in Ottawa and I work with the military. And I am married to Nathan.
Full disclosure.
Just so everyone knows. So I'm going to talk a bit about off season, but for those who are still in their season, I will kind of mention a few things towards the end and make a few recommendations throughout. So kind of coming into the off season, some really key things to focus on is not getting hungry, balancing your energy and carbohydrates. You really want to maximize your lean mass, your muscle mass, and try to minimize as much kind of fat mass that you might put on that often happens in the off season. So really trying to also be on top of your protein, making kind of smart food and drink choices, and then I'll talk a little bit about some mindful eating strategies. So there'll be kind of some snack ideas throughout that you can kind of take away with. But generally from a hunger perspective, we kind of have this this throughout the day our blood sugar kind of goes in waves. And so we want to be careful that we're not getting to the point where you see that green dotted line and it dips really low. And that's where, at least in Nathan's case, he gets quite hangry. And I know that he just needs to go and eat something. So you really don't want to get to that point because it's no fun for anyone that you live with. And you also tend to crave really inappropriate foods or not so healthy foods. So your high fat, high sugar foods. So really trying to stay in that blue line, so you're kind of not having these big spikes and drops in blood sugars, but having a nice wave. So you're looking at kind of maybe having a first meal and then a midday meal, maybe a snack between those two meals, dinner, and then maybe an evening snack. So really trying to eat every 4 to 6 hours in the off season. So when it comes to any days where you might be having a larger, heavier training day, or even a match day, you might consider shortening that time, and maybe you're looking at trying to stay with eating every 4 hours. For kind of the elite athletes I would work with, I would try to get them eating every 2 to 4 hours, but usually trying to stay within that 4-hour range is really great. So we use these plates with athletes as well, and they can be really useful just as a visual to kind of how to arrange your plate. So this would be for kind of your off season, but also an easy training day. And then if you're getting into heavier volumes of training or intensities, you might consider, adding a little bit more of those whole grains onto your plate, but really being careful, if your goal is around some weight management, you might want to just manipulate those whole grains a bit. So you're, coming back to earth, so focusing on grains that are coming from the earth, so are not highly processed. And I usually use fists, so that might be half to 1 fist at meals. And then your protein in the red, so really quality and unprocessed. And I usually think of golf balls, so the size of 4 to 6 golf balls. So you might think of, anywhere from 3 to 6 ounces of lean meat. I also use kind of the palm of your hand can be a nice reference of that too. And then, 1 to 2 tablespoons of healthy fats, and then brightly colored vegetables, and maybe a little bit of fruit as well. And really trying to choose at least 2 different colored vegetables at all meals ideally, so even breakfast. So things like dark greens and reds and blues and purples can be great colors. So they're giving you a wide range of different types of antioxidants, which are going to help manage inflammation and muscle soreness and repair. So when I focus on protein, I kind of mentioned, quality versus an unprocessed option. So really you want to be choosing kind of those really high quality, so like fish and lean ground beef and chicken. And if you choose tofu, that's great, or things like cottage cheese or Greek yogurt. And then really trying to stay away from, your sausages and deep fried meats or very high fatty cuts of meat. And then things like, I know like everyone loves their chicken wings, but those types of proteins are very poor quality. And when we, think of those think of protein, I also think of timing. And this is important both in the off season, but also kind of when you are reffing and regularly reffing every week. So getting your protein, every, like especially 4 hours, and getting about 20 to 30 grams, and that would be kind of those, 3 to 6 golf balls or so of protein is going to be really important to maintain as much muscle mass as you can, but also for things like recovery and repair of your muscle tissues, really important for managing muscle soreness, especially post-game. So, and really trying to choose those high quality options as well. So snacks are also a really important time to try to get some protein. So I just kind of put some snack ideas here because this is often the time where we might just grab a granola bar or even just, a healthier option like a piece of fruit. And so how can you add some protein to that? That's also going to help you feel a bit fuller, a little bit more satisfied in that snack to take you on to that next meal. So I mentioned carbohydrates, so really coming back to the earth. So things like whole grain breads and cereals. So some really great cereals would be things like Cashew Go Lean is a really great whole grain, high protein cereal. Oatmeal as well. Brown or long grain white rice even would be great options. Yams or potatoes, and I think potatoes even white potatoes get a really bad name, but they are a really good source of carbohydrates, and they're quite full of nutrients like vitamin C. And then things like beans or lentils are a great source of carbohydrate, as well as your fruit, and then some vegetables as well. And then finally with healthy fats, so you're trying to stick with things like good sources of oil, so olive oil or avocado oil, or even virgin coconut oil would be a good choice. Nuts and seeds, nut butters, fatty fish, olives, avocados, and a lot of these options are also going to be helpful for managing inflammation. So having them at meals can be really important there, especially those high quality options. I know some of these messages are very, maybe they kind of, I find nutrition can be very common sense. So I always say to my, the people I speak to, it might sound common sense, but it's the common practice that really matters. So when I talk about, fruits and vegetables, the dietitian talking about vegetables, but it is really important to choose these rich colors and try to have one of each color at every meal if you can. So that might just even mean having, you might have a breakfast wrap and you might add some spinach and some chopped tomatoes or some mushrooms, and just there you've enriched, gotten some more anti-inflammatory antioxidants from your foods. And then fluids are really important. So especially in the off season, you want to be choosing kind of lower sugar fluid options where you don't have those high needs for carbohydrates. So things like water, or if it's milk, or if you don't choose, cow's milk, it might be almond milk or cashew milk or soy milk, whatever your poison, or unsweetened flavored sparkling water. And then really trying to stay away from flavored milks and sports drinks, and obviously your Rockstar or Red Bulls, which are really high in sugar. Finally, treats. So I try to just stick to an 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time, you're really trying to choose those foods that I've just mentioned, and then 20% of the time, you are, don't deny yourself, but choose some, good quality treats. So whether that's your favorite cookie, or for me, I adore ice cream and I couldn't live without it. So I use this rule for, having ice cream. And then, you probably don't want to be indulging in these treats, especially like pre-game or, on match day, where it really might not sit well in your stomach. So just kind of balancing that out, so that 80-20 rule can be really helpful. So I'm going to go into a little bit of mindfulness. So I find this is often what we forget about, and like kind of coming back to the table and coming back to really paying attention to eating. So we have this like mindless versus mindful eating. And so mindless eating would be really not listening to your body and your signals of hunger or fullness. Eating based on emotions. So whether you're tired or you're sad, or you're, happy, whatever emotion it is. Randomly eating at different places. So our car is often a place where we tend to just eat, and it does kind of come into that mindless eating pattern. And then when you're multitasking and eating, so really focusing on the task of eating. So really stopping when you're full, listening to your bodies, trying to sit down at the table, whether that's with your family or friends. And then really choosing foods that I've just spoken about that are nourishing. So I use this hunger scale. It's really helpful, especially in kind of off-season times or on rest days or off days, when you are trying to manage, like your energy and your carbohydrate. So you want to stay in this green area, so where, when you're ready to have a meal, you are feeling a bit hungry, you're not hangry, you're not starving, where you might choose inappropriate foods. And then you're going to eat until you're satisfied, not until you're stuffed and you're like, your guts are hanging out. So you just want to kind of stay within that 4 to 7 range. And then I use this kind of mouth hunger, stomach hunger, and heart hunger as a good way to check in with, before you might eat something. I find this is really helpful in the evening, where we tend to maybe sit and watch TV and grab not always the best quality foods. So, that mouth hunger would be, you have this need for something crunchy, so you want to have some chips or something creamy, and you want to have some ice cream, and it's not actually true stomach hunger, where you actually have a desire to eat. It's been 4 to 6 hours since the last time you've eaten, and you need to fuel your body. And then heart hunger, that's that emotional eating that I mentioned prior. But we all have unexpected cravings, so I've kind of included a few options that might help when you do have those cravings at strange times in the day. And these are going to be some better quality options that are going to satisfy maybe that need for something crunchy or something smooth, but are going to have more fiber in them, more protein in them, healthier fats as well. So just a quick note about eating away from home. So this always comes up, and this is something that is all year round. So you're always going to be either, dare I say, Christmas season is kind of around the corner, but this is something, when you're going out with friends, you're going out for a party, or even if you're just going out for a meal. So say you have, Sunday brunch, and you go out to a restaurant or you're going out to a buffet, these are all things that you want to be aware of, choosing some better quality options over others. So, in the case of breakfast or brunch, you probably want to be choosing some whole grain or even sprouted grain toast over pastries. You might want to choose some even roasted potatoes over hash browns, and even, oatmeal over kind of, quicker cooking oats, back bacon or Canadian bacon over strip bacon. So these kind of small changes that you can make, even, choosing instead of having potatoes and bread, if you think of that plate that I showed, you might ask the server to have some tomatoes on the side, or even some fruit instead of that toast, or instead of the potatoes. And then when you are going to parties or buffets, some behaviors that can be helpful. So, trying to eat a little bit before, especially a protein-rich meal. This is especially important if you're going out to a party and there's going to be a ton of not such great foods. Try to plan for treat foods throughout the week. So that 80-20 rule that I mentioned. You might want to bring a healthy food if it's kind of a potluck. You might want to bring a really great option if you don't think, there may not be a great option in that that other people are bringing. Scanning the buffet. So I find I always learn from Nathan's mistakes. So we tend to dive right into the buffet. And so I always try to talk about mindfulness with him, and trying to scan the buffet and think about what you're going to eat as well. Trying to not face the buffet and be far away from the buffet. So making it as difficult as possible to make a bad choice is kind of the end game. And then, eat slowly and try to wait it out until you go in for seconds. But if you're legitimately hungry, go in for seconds and try to follow that same plate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some some around matches, and so that match day nutrition for those who are still in season. I'll go into a little bit more of it kind of later in the year. But just a couple key things. So the night before a game, so just being aware you don't necessarily need to carb load, but when I showed you that plate where kind of a quarter of your plate would be whole grains, you might want to have a little bit more, as well as some protein and some vegetables and fruit, just so you have a little bit more kind of carbohydrate stores in your muscle to get ready for that game. On that match day, you want to have a decent sized meal, about depending on the game, but 2 to 4 hours out will give you enough time to digest kind of a larger meal. So that might be, a lunch meal where you might have a sandwich and maybe, a salad with that, and, something hydrating to drink as well. And then maybe about 1 to 2 hours out, you might have a small snack. And if you have a nervous stomach, sometimes a liquid option can work. So it might be a smoothie, or even a bar. So something as simple as, a granola bar, or even a lower protein bar that has enough carbohydrates to keep your energy levels up. And Nathan kind of talked at the beginning of this webinar about kind of decision making, and carbohydrates play a really big role in your brain and fueling your brain to make good decisions. So making sure you do have some carbohydrates. Some people might also want to have a small carbohydrate rich snack 30 minutes out to start a match, and that would be something as simple as maybe it's a couple swigs of some sports drink, maybe again it's a little bit of a banana. So very simple and easy to digest. Staying hydrated throughout the game is really important. So something as simple as just water. If you notice you sweat a lot more, or if it's a little bit hotter out, you might consider adding a little bit of electrolytes to that. And then in your recovery, within 60 minutes is a really good time to try to you want to refuel with some carbohydrates, repair with some protein, and rehydrate with some hydrating fluids. This is really important to do before you might have a couple beers post game, really trying to get that recovery piece in. Okay, that's it for me. Trying to stay on task and on time.
Perfect. we are running very tight to our time limits of an hour, so we might go a couple minutes over, but just a couple of final key points from me before we say thanks and sign off and try and address as many questions as potentially possible. But for our coaches and match officials, I think what we're going to see is most of the content presented here today would be stuff that we're going to take away in our off season for most of our referees right now. And then for those who are in BC, obviously they might be using this maybe more so in the new year. Take some time to plan out what does this actually mean for you as opposed to for this Saturday. Yeah, how is our referee actually outlining some of the specific areas they need to address? So instead of our usual match planning document, this is more something we'd want to see in some off-season planning or some planning going into the second half of the season out west. So some things to take away from that. Is the referee's behavior based on making small improvements over time? One of the things I'd be very wary of is, and having spoken to Ashley, obviously, and Phil about these two topics, is to all of a sudden decide you're going to completely revamp your diet or revamp your training schedule on a day-to-day basis is likely a bit unrealistic. So what are the small things that we can take away from today, and how do we make these small incremental changes? So I don't know what I was saying with that last point. I apologize. Many of these personal will not change over time. What I meant to say was many of these attributes that we have and these characteristics of our being, and there's a specific word I'm looking for right now in terms of our habits. They don't change very quickly, right? So just making sure that we have an understanding of that. Finally, as we always do, and I'm just going to throw this slide up here so we have that quick reminder of our World Rugby High Tackle Framework and that our content is available at World Rugby. We saw during the World Cup there was a major emphasis on making sure that dangerous contact around the head and neck area was dealt with quite severely, and the repercussions of it ended up being quite severe as well in terms of player discipline. So let's just make sure that as we wrap up our seasons, there's still some finals for universities across the country being played, and there is still obviously a competition happening in BC. So just be aware of that as we continue on with our year. That's it from me as well. We have about a minute and a bit to take a couple of questions. I want to once again thank Phil Dunn and Ashley Armstrong for their contributions. They put in a lot of hard work, and I really appreciate the fact that they joined us. People probably learned more about my marriage than they did anything else today, but that's okay. Every little bit helps. So I think we might have. Karen, yes, I did get your other question about some admin stuff, and I will be sure to get to that a little later. Anything about the topic today? Doesn't seem to be. So with that, I want to say thank you very much for everyone who attended. We will put this up on YouTube as we do, and if anyone has any questions, please fire away afterwards. Have a great night, everybody.